Chapter 2, Bird of Ill Omen. Though Nancy and George ran as fast as they could, the stranger who had snipped the wire cage outdistanced them. Apparently, he was familiar with the territory. He had skirted the rough terrain, but the girls had to watch constantly for stones and pits. They finally stopped, out of breath, their faces flushed pink from the exertion. "It's a shame he got away," George said in disgust. Nancy was more optimistic. "At least we can give a good description of him. Let's check. He had a long, thin nose and dark, squinty eyes." George nodded. "And a full reddish beard." "He was of medium height," Nancy added. George chuckled. "And he wore sports clothes that looked too large for him." The girls trudged back toward the cage where they had left Bess. In the meantime, she had been breaking branches off a nearby tree and stuffing them into the hole. Some of the larger birds in the cage that looked like hawks began to squawk loudly. Realizing she was a stranger and about to cut off their chance for freedom, they made an ear-splitting racket. "Oh, be quiet," Bess ordered. The birds, however, paid no attention to the command. In a few moments, the squawking brought a muscular-looking man on the run from a barn back of the cages. He was dressed in a coverall, and Bess was sure he worked at the Thirston farm. "What's going on here?" he thundered at her. "And what are you trying to do to that cage?" Bess was frightened. She asked, "Are you Mr. Thirston?" "No, I'm not," the man replied. "My name's Rous. I work for Mr. Thirston. Well, young lady, are you going to answer my questions?" Quickly, Bess told him of seeing a man cutting the wire cage. "When he spotted me and my friends, he ran away. They went after him. I stayed to plug this hole. That's what I'm doing." "A likely story," Rous replied. "I think you're connected with those people who are trying to drive Mr. Thirston away from here." "I am not. If I were, I certainly wouldn't be standing here and trying to explain." She was no longer afraid of the man, merely angry. Bess's face reddened as Nancy and George, who were hurrying back, saw her talking heatedly to the man. Every once in a while, he would shake his finger at her. "Something's wrong," Nancy exclaimed, and started to run, with George keeping pace alongside her. When they reached the cage, Bess said, "Girls, tell this man what we saw. He won't believe me. And guess what? He thinks I'm connected with people who were trying to run Mr. Thirston off his property." George's eyes blazed. "That's ridiculous! Utterly ridiculous!" she cried out. "Incidentally, who are you?" Bess replied, "He says he works for Mr. Thirston." "Then I suggest," said Nancy, "that everyone calm down." She told him about the man clipping the wire cage and the chase. She ended by saying, "We didn't capture him, but we have a good description of him. Do you know anybody who's of medium height, has a long, thin nose, dark, squinty eyes, a full reddish beard, and wears oversized sports clothes?" The expression on Rous's face changed instantly. "I guess you girls are telling the truth, and I'm sorry I spoke to you harshly, miss," he said to Bess. "I don't know anyone who fits that description." Rous then said he would go for some material with which to mend the fence. "Will you girls please stay here for a few moments longer until I get back? Don't let any of these birds fly out," he said, hurrying off. When Rous returned, Nancy asked if the girls could help him. "Well, yes, you can," he answered. "These birds may think I'm here to feed them and fly through this hole before I can get it covered." He said to Bess, "Your idea of putting branches in there was good." He now removed them. Bess smiled. A new piece of steel cable was fitted into the section that had been cut out. Then, as the girls held it tightly against the opening, Rous quickly threaded a wire in and out, weaving the two sections together firmly. "We came to see the Thirstons," Nancy told him. When the job was finished, he took the girls to the rear door of the farmhouse and ushered them inside. "Please wait here a minute," he said. "Mrs. Thirston is a semi-invalid, and sometimes she doesn't feel well enough to have visitors." He disappeared toward the front of the house, but presently came back with a ruddy-faced, jolly-looking man. His graying black hair had receded from his forehead a couple of inches. "Oscar," said Rous, "these are the girls who came to see you, and they'll tell you what happened at one of the cages. I must go out now and tend to the animals." He hurried off as Nancy introduced herself, Bess, and George. "How do you do?" Mr. Thirston said. He looked at Nancy. "You are Carson Drew's daughter?" Nancy nodded. "Dad has told me about taking your case. He asked me to come out and meet you and look around your place." "I'm pretty proud of my birds," said their owner. "By the way, call me Oscar. Everybody does. I'm sorry Mrs. Thirston isn't quite ready for visitors. Come outside. I'll tell you something about my birds." On the way to the cages, Nancy briefed him about the wire snipper. Oscar remarked, "One more bit of harassment. I don't know how much your father has told you about the trouble here, but I'm being bothered all the time in one way or another. Threats, the warning of a curse to be put on me, and Jinx is on my birds." Nancy told him that she knew about the housing development to be built by the high-rise construction company, and that Oscar did not want to sell his property. "That's right," he said. "And my wife adores this place. She isn't very well, and I'm afraid that if we have to move out and leave all this, it would be very bad for her health." "Tell me some more about what has been happening to you," Nancy requested. "About a week ago," Oscar replied, "a stink bomb was tossed through an open window. We had to get out of the house for one whole day." "How ghastly," Bess put in. "Yes, it was," Oscar went on. "A few days ago, I received an unsigned note in the mail. It said, 'You're holding up the chance for your neighbors to make a lot of money. Sell out or you will regret it.'" "Where is the note?" Nancy asked. "My wife found it and threw the note away." George frowned. "Do the police know about this?" Oscar shook his head. "I had left everything to Mr. Drew." Bess smiled. "Nancy will never tell you, but she's an amateur detective. Sometimes she works with her father and has solved lots of cases. She lets George and me help her, and it's pretty exciting. Recently, we all worked on a really spooky one, The Secret of Mirror Bay." Oscar's eyes opened wide. "I'm glad you told me. Nancy, I believe you and your friends have a real mystery to solve right here. Well, let's start with my telling you something about the birds." He led the girls to a cage that contained many varieties of woodpeckers. "There's a joke about these birds," he told them. "It's said they live an upright life. You notice how each one stands erect on the trunk of a tree? These birds can do this because they have short legs and toes that are strong and tipped with sharp, curved nails. 2 of the toes face forward, the others to the side. In this way, they can cling to the bark. Besides, they have pointed tails with a stiff, strong shaft which they use for propping themselves against the trunk. If you look closely, you will see that a woodpecker's bill is straight, hard, and comes to a point. It certainly makes an ideal digging tool to get the insects from the bark. By the way, the constant pounding would probably make the birds ill if they didn't have very strong skulls to take up the shock." The 3 girls listened intently, taking in all these details. Oscar said, "I suppose you can't see their tongues, but they're long and the birds can stick them out to an astonishing length beyond their bills. Since the tongue has backward-pointing barbs at the tip." Oscar smiled. "It's bad news for an insect that gets caught in it." The naturalist farmer moved on to a smaller cage. Immediately, Bess cried out, "It's It's a wryneck! Oscar looked at her in amazement. Few people know about this type of woodpecker. How'd you learn about it? Bess looked at Nancy, not knowing if she should tell the story of the stuffed wryneck left on the Drews' lawn. Nancy did not answer the question directly. She asked, "Where did you get this bird?" "It belongs to a girl who is attending Harper University in town here," Oscar replied. "She's a Eurasian and brought this pet from Europe. She's staying with us." Nancy was startled. Could there be any connection between the girl and the person who had left the wryneck at the Drew house? End of chapter 2.